We just received some huge news from worst case scenario for Bitcoin in 2030. Absolutely worst case scenario is 258,000. But they are predicting probably around 682,000, which will give it a higher market cap than gold. But the bull case, which very may well come, Bitcoin will be at $1.5 million each by 2030. Okay, think about that. Having one Bitcoin being worth $1 million. So some of you guys have just became a whole coiner, just accumulated one Bitcoin. Just think about it. In 7 years, 8 years, 7 years, that one Bitcoin could make you a millionaire already, right? Think about it. It's insane to think about, but when Bitcoin moves, it moves really fast. And when you take into account that people are starting to pay attention globally, not just in the US, not just in Europe, not just in Australia, everywhere around the world, people are starting to recognize that fiat is no good and you need something like Bitcoin. And as more and more money flows out of these other asset buckets into the bucket of Bitcoin, well, definitely it's going to drive it much higher, much, much higher. Bitcoin is kind of hovering around 24,000, getting ready to make its next leg up. And there's a lot of new predictions, okay, of where Bitcoin will be, not just in this next cycle. What about the cycle after that? What about 2030? Forget 2024. 2024 is the next halving event, right? 2025 is the peak. So the next halving event will be 2028, and then 2029 will be peak. So where will Bitcoin be 2 cycles from now, right? Or 1.5 cycle from now. And many people think it could be at like $10 million. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. But there is one fund analyst that thinks that it could happen because if you look at Bitcoin versus every other asset out there, Bitcoin is the best. It's the scarcest, right? And the scarcity keeps increasing because of the halving event. Early stage growth, and this doesn't mention about Bitcoin is not only a currency, a store of value, but also the most decentralized and open network and the most secure network we have today. You can't replicate Bitcoin's network. You just can't. No government will allow anyone to do so anymore, but they have allowed Bitcoin to exist, right? But if you look at equities, yes, some are scarce, but not nearly as scarce as Bitcoin. And the returns on growth is nowhere near Bitcoin, right? So even though equities is a good alternative in terms of if you want to beat inflation, if you want a good asset to hold, right? But nowhere near as good as Bitcoin. And then you have scarce assets, somewhat scarce, like land. Well, land is scarce, but there's a lot of land out there. Art and collectibles, yes, some scarce. Gold, you can argue is scarce, although you can always dig more or collect a meteor. You know, it's good to hold them, but again, is it fast growing as Bitcoin? No. And then you have inflationary assets like fiat, okay, which is, I'm surprised that he put airline miles in there. I never thought of airline miles as an asset, but I guess it is. But fiat just keeps inflating away. So the buying power keeps decreasing over time. So the longer and the more you hold, the more you're going to lose. And then depreciate assets like cars and buildings and equipment. Well, buildings can be appreciated, so that's part of real estate, part of the scarce asset. But other things, mostly like, like clothes and fancy cars and fancy whatever, right? They don't appreciate, they just depreciate. But anyways, bottom line is this: Bitcoin is going to steal everyone's lunch, right? More and more money from these other sectors will come into Bitcoin, which is why this guy's arguing by 2030, you could have Bitcoin at $10 million because everything else will be sucked dry, basically. No, he didn't say sucked dry, but just even a small percentage of everything, of all the money out there, okay? If it comes into Bitcoin, it's going to push Bitcoin to like $10 million each. Think about that. This is, I think, self-explanatory. In terms of Bitcoiners around the world, about 100 million. That still seems high to me. I don't think there's 100 million people out in the earth that actually have Bitcoin. But even if it's true, compared to the non-Bitcoiner, okay, there's about 8 billion. So imagine when all 8 billion, or even 50% of the billion, or even, 10% of the world, okay, try to get into Bitcoin. It's still so early. Very, very early indeed. And then you can see here, this also looks at the aggregate of all the major crypto out there, including Bitcoin and some of the stable coins at ETH. And you add everything together, it's hard to notice, but if you look at a red line, you can see how the red line started going up a little bit. And after it started going up a little bit, you can see the price of Bitcoin shot up, right? So that just means that just a little bit of money brought Bitcoin up in a big way. But imagine when a lot of money come in, what that's going to do to Bitcoin, right? So just think about that. Good stuff. Good stuff. I mean, a couple of charts. This one is looking at S&P 500, NASDAQ, Dow, and Bitcoin. And you can see that all of them have formed this pattern. I guess it's called an M shape or M pattern. But you can see how it makes a top, bottom, a higher top, and then a lower bottom, and then boom, you skyrocket, right? So Bitcoin has formed that M already, but it has not made that next leg up. So is it about to? Well, it certainly looks like it. It certainly looks like it. And then lastly, this is where we are versus previous periods when we have hit bottom, start recovering, right? There's a little pause point before we start heading up. Kind of like this M shape, right? Right before we start blowing up, that's kind of like where we are. And what comes next could be absolutely amazing.